I want to get to the latest out of the Middle East. Take a look at your screen right there as the New York Times now reporting that Iranian troops are fleeing from Syria following a rebel offensive. The Israel War Room calling those troops, quote, terrorists and adding, quote, good riddance. Iran's terrorist army was only in Syria to facilitate attacks on Israeli and Arab civilians by Hezbollah. As of this, all of this rather happening as insurgents pursue a shock offensive against Syrian President Bashar Assad that quickly captured Aleppo, another key city, and a string of towns across the country's northwest area. Now, unlike 10 years ago, when Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah helped Assad's forces retake Aleppo, this time the president does appear to be mostly on his own. Russia is, of course, preoccupied with its war with Ukraine, and Hezbollah has been significantly weakened by its year-long fight with Israel. I do want to talk about this and other developments in the Middle East, so let's bring in Joe Truzman, a senior research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the editor of the Foundation's Long War Journal. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and help break it all down.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, I want to talk a little bit about that report from the New York Times, as they are saying that those Iranian troops are fleeing Syria. Looking at this as a whole, what impact is all of this likely to have on Israel?
Right. So it's very important to understand a few things. Yes, it does have an impact on Israel. I'll say this, Israel knows Bashar al-Assad. All right, the president of Syria. It knows its foe. For years, Israel has been striking inside Syria against Iranian targets, including Syrian armed forces as well that have been assisting Iran. But the thing is, Syria rarely retaliated, rarely responded against Israel. So essentially, Assad was manageable for the Israelis, right? So nevertheless, there are a lot of things going on right now. And I think what the decision makers in Jerusalem are concerned about right now is that, if Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is this jihadist organization, this jihadist group and its allies that are leading this offensive against Assad's forces, are they going to take over Syria? And if they take over Syria, what's going to happen? So we have to remember, too, that Islamists, jihadists, generally aren't friendly to the Israelis, all right? So I think right now what the Israeli decision makers are doing is trying to figure out what the next step is, because as many of us, as I'm sure you've noticed, is that this offensive has been quite quick, right? And these opposition forces are nearing Damascus, so it's quite quick. So we're going to see what happens here, but right now I think this is definitely going to impact the Israelis. And something else I just want to quickly say is that we understand, or we know, that Iran's axis, right? They have Hezbollah, they have the Palestinian armed groups, and others, and the Iraqis, the Houthis, but also Syria has played a major role in this axis, okay? And Iran losing Syria to these jihadists is a blow to its axis of resistance, that it has used against the Israelis. So a lot is going on right now. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
And I do want to pop this video back up that I was just showing. This is actually provided by the Israel Defense Forces. And we know that Israel does have troops that are now stationed at Golan Heights at the Syrian border. Is it simply because of all of that internal fighting, digging a little bit deeper into what we were talking about here, or is there some other reason as well?
Right. So it has everything to do with what's happening in Syria. We have to understand these are jihadist groups, all right, that are carrying out this offensive against Assad's forces, and they're winning. I think the Israelis, what they're doing is a wise move, because listen, during the Syrian civil war, when groups were fighting, when Assad's forces lost the control of the border area between the Golan and southern Syria, there was a lot of fighting in the area, and there was spillover into spilled over into Israeli territory. I mean, the Israelis, they actually carried out strikes in Syrian territory during the Syrian civil war in that area. Primarily against the Islamic State, but nevertheless, it was a problem for the Israelis. And I think right now, what the Israelis are doing is they're bolstering their defenses against possible action. And I will say, actually, this just happened just a few minutes ago, right before we went on air, that the IDF published a statement saying that they were assisting United Nations forces in this area in southern Syria called Khader, where armed individuals were attacking a United Nations post. So that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here, that this fighting in Syria creates instability. Armed groups rise up. They start fighting each other, and it can spill over into Israeli territory. So this is why I think the Israelis are bolstering their defenses along the Golan Heights.
Yeah, and Joe, I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on in Lebanon, because we know that ceasefire, as of right now, is it still technically intact? It appears to be very, very fragile. We know there is still fighting going on, but as of right now, is that ceasefire still in effect?
Right. So it is. Thankfully, it is. The IDF has published some statements saying that it has carried out airstrikes against Hezbollah because Hezbollah they violated terms of the ceasefire, meaning that Hezbollah was bringing terrorists and weapons into areas it was not allowed to, and that it threatened IDF forces. So the Israelis did have taken action. And I believe just a little while ago, the IDF published a statement saying that they had eliminated a terrorist. It didn't say when, but that the terrorist had violated the ceasefire negotiations, and they said it was Hezbollah. So, nevertheless, they are carrying out these actions, but the ceasefire appears to be holding. And now with the events happening in Syria, I think both Hezbollah and Israel will want to maintain that ceasefire because, listen, what happens in Syria not only affects Israel, but it also affects Lebanon. So again, a lot of things happening in the region, but I think both actors, both sides are going to hold the ceasefire.
We know that an Israeli delegation is expected to travel to Egypt next week for renewed ceasefire hostage release talks. Is that overall a positive sign? And while you're talking, I do want to actually pop up this shot that we now have in. This is coming from Al-Aqsa Hospital there in Gaza. It's one of the many cameras we have in that area. But overall, is this, let's say, a positive sign?
Ceasefire negotiations, the way I see it, they're always a positive sign. I think both sides do want to end the war, but both sides have their goals, right? For instance, the Israelis, one of their goals of the war is to get the hostages back. And Hamas is holding these hostages, not only Hamas, but other Palestinian armed groups. Nevertheless, for the Israelis to get all these hostages back, it's likely the best option here is likely to get a ceasefire with Hamas. However, the Israelis need to do this on their terms, right? They can't have Hamas back in power just to regenerate and start fighting again some years down the road. So I think this is what the Israelis are trying to avoid. Conversely, Hamas, they are definitely putting the pressure on the Israelis to negotiate a ceasefire on Hamas's terms. Just earlier today and earlier this week, Hamas has published 2 hostage videos showing these captives in what appears to be in a tunnel. So Hamas is definitely pulling these levers, okay, to pressure the Israeli government into a ceasefire. So I think something may come out of this, all right? But, I won't hold my breath. As you alluded, we've seen ceasefires come, at least ceasefire proposals come and go over the last 14, 15 months, and most of them, of course, have failed. So let's hope for something good here. But again, I wouldn't hold my breath.
One more question for you, Joe, before I let you go. There's a well-known Gaza activist who was actually assassinated, we're told, by Hamas-affiliated gunmen on Friday. Now, the Saudi news channel Al Hadath reports that the group stormed Zayed Abu Haya's tent over there in Khan Yunis, dragged him naked in front of everyone, then kicked and beat him to death. Does that further show that Hamas is inflicting violence on the people of Gaza overall, when you look at it as a whole? Again, that is just one example, but are there a lot more?
Right. As you said, that's just one example. We've seen Hamas, and there's plenty of evidence to back this up, to support this. But Hamas, they use civilians, Palestinian civilians, as a shield. And this isn't just by coincidence. It's a deliberate strategy. We've seen Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups, of course, use hospitals. They embed their military infrastructure within civilian buildings. Hamas and company have fired mortars and rockets and established command centers in humanitarian zones set up by the Israeli military. So what Hamas is essentially doing, and its allies, they're leveraging the Palestinian population and to use it against the Israelis. And when the Israelis retaliate against these command centers or terrorists, what happens is that Hamas will say, well, look, the Israelis are killing civilians. But what Hamas won't tell you is that they're embedding their infrastructure within the civilian territories or within the civilian infrastructure. So unfortunately, I'm not surprised this happened to this Palestinian activist. So again, Hamas, what they're trying to do is they're trying to flex muscle here. They still have some power in Gaza. So when they see dissent rising inside of their territory, they're going to stifle it. And I think this is a perfect example of it.
All right, Joe Truzman, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break it all down. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
That'll pretty much do it. I would just continue watching events in Syria. They're going by pretty quickly, so keep an eye on it.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.